Good morning. My name is Rob Mattern, and I am with Mattern consultant Cory Riner, who leads our administrative services consulting practice. Welcome to our September coffee break, addressing and preventing issues in administrative support restructuring. Cory, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. How are you, Rob?
I'm doing excellent. Got a good night's sleep last night, so I'm well rested and prepared to tackle this topic. What we're going to cover today is we're going to identify common pitfalls in administrative support restructuring and teach you how to prevent them going forward. We're going to develop strategies for effective short-term responses when you do outsource your administrative services. We're going to identify and implement proactive measures to avoid future failures. And we're going to talk about how to evaluate the success of your administrative support models. We received a terrific amount of questions from our attendees, and our plan is to address them, all of them, throughout this webinar today. Just want to give a quick shout out to our clients on the call: Turner Paget, Foley Hoag, Marshall Dennehy, Reinhardt, Gold Ratner, Frost Brown, and last but not least, Fox Rothschild. For our clients who are eligible for the $50 Dunkin' Donuts gift card, we're going to let you know right after this call, so you'll be able to go out and buy some donuts to have with your Starbucks gift card. So before we get started, some simple housekeeping rules. Everyone is muted. Unmute to speak, ask questions, and participate. Make sure to introduce yourself when you do unmute yourself. Please feel free to submit questions through chat if you prefer, and we will work them in as best as we can. And be sure to keep yourself on mute if you are not speaking to avoid any background noise. Okay. Cory, why don't you just take a minute or two to tell everyone about your background in administrative services and how you got involved in it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started in legal administrative services with an outsourcing provider, Williams Lee. There I managed service delivery for an AmLaw 100 firm where we provided document processing and administrative support. From there, I moved to Donnelley, where I expanded my role a little bit and started overseeing implementations as well as service delivery for administrative, marketing, billing, and document processing functions. And I moved on to Epiq, where I oversaw 2 of their global resource centers where they provide offsite administrative billing, document processing, marketing services, and led onboarding of clients and implementations there as well.
Okay, what brought you over to the dark side? Or I'll say, what brought you to Mattern?
Yeah, good question. I thought all of those best practices I learned, things that firms came to Williams Lee, Epiq, Donnelley looking to solve, and thought implementing those best practices at Mattern in an unbiased fashion would further benefit firms, as well as knowing how to structure an outsourcing agreement to the benefit of both the firm and the outsourcer.
Okay. Well, I tell you, Cory's been with us over 2 years. Great addition to the team, and brings a lot of expertise in this area. So we're going to start off with a polling question to make sure we have a feel for who's in the audience. We'll give you about a minute to fill this out, but just want to know who's in-house, who's outsourced, who's already went down that path, who's running a hybrid operation, and then rate your success on a scale of 1 to 10.
Looks like the results are rolling in. We'll give everyone about 5 to 10 more seconds.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay, 58% in-house, only 4% outsourcing, 38% run a hybrid operation. Okay, on a scale to 1 to 10, didn't get much of a response, but about people on a scale of 1 to 10, they're rating themselves. I'm just pull down. Some are giving themselves a 2. Okay, 5, 7. Okay, majority of the people are giving themselves an 8, which is excellent. Excellent. Okay. And then again, 27% are giving themselves a 9 and 10. Okay, that's good. They're really outstanding results in regards to, you know, R. Donnelley just came out with a report that said 97% are rating of firms that do outsource are only rating themselves average. Okay, only 3% are in that upper range. So, and the people we got on the call here today are doing a little bit better job than what R. Donnelley came up with their on their survey. Okay, we're going to start off with Cory just walking through the proper way to restructure your administrative services. And again, this is whether you're doing this in-house or outsourced, or you're going through that process and trying to decide what is the best solution for the firm. After he walks through that, then we're going to start knocking off these questions. The rest, and please, if something we don't cover a question you want answered, please submit it through chat, or again, take yourself off mute and speak up. So, what are the questions a firm has to answer before you start restructuring your administrative services? Again, whether it's in-house or outsourced, but just starting the process.
So I think before we get into those questions, looking at the different models that firms have adopted and that Mattern has found successful would be helpful. So there is the traditional or direct model, which is the traditional secretary to attorney ratio. So you have a secretary that's supporting a set number of attorneys, and that's where they go for support. And then there is the pooled model, which is, it can be similar to the centralized model with the exception that everyone's not in the same place. So you have an office in New York and LA, and you have 5 legal administrative assistants in each location, and those 10 are supporting all of the attorneys. So they're balancing work, looking at strengths and weaknesses, and divvying out work based on that. And then there's the centralized model where you pull all of those legal administrative assistants or other support departments into a single location, and the work goes there, and then a workflow coordinator or similar position then distributes the work based on the workload needed and turnaround times. And then lastly, but not leastly, there is outsourcing, which is essentially in most cases going to be a centralized service, because you're going to look at putting those resources in an offsite location where all work gets funneled to there, and then they distribute it back to the attorneys. But those are the 4 dominant models. But that's not to say that you have to fit in one of those buckets. You can mix them up. You can use a combination of 3 or all 4 of them, any number of ways. And to get there, as Rob mentioned, that there are a series of steps you need to take in order to ensure that it's going to be successful. So the first thing is to know what your support staff's doing. So looking at tasks and volumes. So knowing the skill level needed to complete the tasks, the volume of the tasks, how many staff you're going to need to complete the tasks in each of those buckets, how the workflow is going to work. Are you going to have a legal administrative assistant sitting on site that is then delegating that work to those departments? Are you going to have those departments have a workflow coordinator type of role where they get it into a certain email address through a workflow tool and then distribute it out themselves? And then using that task and volume, that's going to also let you know the number of staff you need in each area.
Okay, what about okay, all this information we gotta gather. What if I don't have access to this information? How do I get it?
So that's not uncommon. In fact, that's the scenario we face most of the times as firms don't have that data. They're not tracking it, didn't have a reason to track it until they considered restructuring. So there are a number of different ways you could have non-billable time entered into your timekeeping system, whether it's Intap or whatever system you're using. You can implement a weekly or monthly sheet where support staff are entering in every task they do and the hours associated with that and keep track of it that way. You put in a survey where they're saying how many hours per month or week they're spending on tasks. You could implement a big hand or ServiceNow and start tracking it. The downside of those measures are that then you're going to be looking at a waiting period of 6 months to a year to gather enough data to make reliable assumptions. One tool that Mattern likes to use is Revelation Legal, which is it's a survey tool. It gathers an estimate of time spent on each task. It was developed by law firms. It was with feedback from law firm administrators, law firm staff. It's been tweaked numerous times over the years to adequately measure tasks that law firms are performing regularly. And then with that, we get an allocation of hours, an allocation of number of tasks, and an allocation of cost for those tasks. So we can look at that full picture in a relatively short time span. It typically takes about 2 to 3 weeks to gather the results. And then there is some time analyzing that result to determine what those tasks are and how to develop a plan to structure support to accommodate that.
Okay, so we got to gather the information to create the model to try it, okay? Obviously, there's tweaks along the way, modifications. If I outsource it under that scenario, usually the outsourcing provider will reevaluate throughout a 6-month period, come back with recommendations, which is good, but you may be overpaying up front or whatever. On the in-house, if I want to do this in-house, one big area that you have to gather that information, you have to have that data, but really it's the soft cost of managing this type of operation. Okay, and when law firms say, I want to be hiring people anyway, what's the usual feedback that we hear or we provide?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that we consistently hear is we're constantly training, we're constantly recruiting, spending all of this time looking for people that fit this job description that aren't in today's market all that prevalent. Firms are generally looking for a pretty wide skill set to fill positions of folks that are retiring that have been with the firm for 15, 20, 30 years. And that's not what today's market is being trained to do. So that can be a pretty sizable task for a law firm to manage internally.
Okay. Okay, anything else they have to consider? If they're looking to outsource or change their structure in-house, anything else they got to worry about?
So I think the volumes and tasks are obviously a critical component to getting the right structure in place. But just as important is the attorney's input. So if you have a traditional direct support model today, looking at what attorneys are, what they like about that model versus what they dislike about that model, holding focus groups, doing surveys, getting that feedback directly from the attorneys is critical. I think in our projects, that is one of the most important factors of determining what model is going to work. Because you have the tasks and volumes and you think this is perfect, this will work for our firm, and then you roll it out and the attorneys don't like it. It doesn't meet what their expectations were. And getting that feedback from them is important, not only for developing a successful model to implement, but also so that they know they were involved in the creation and rollout of that plan.
Okay, so we need that attorney buy-in. Okay, we also got change management, big change management function we got to talk about. But the attorney buy-in, and you mentioned about you roll it out and it doesn't work. Now that hasn't happened at Mattern, thank goodness. But in other entities that you've been with, you roll it out, it hasn't worked. Okay, can I go back and do attorney focus groups and find out why after the fact?
You can. It's incredibly hard to go back after there's been a failure or a sense of failure by the attorneys, because you only get that one chance to make a first impression, is the saying, and that is absolutely true for attorneys. There, as an example, in one project that we recently completed for a Southwestern law firm, they had implemented an attorney resource team for first and second year associates. They rolled it out. Some of the legal administrative assistants they had designated to be part of that team, they weren't thrilled about the idea. They resigned, so that team got considerably less, and there was delayed turnaround times and consistent work product. The associates thought, well, why would I do that when I know how to do this myself? Partners started saying, don't use that, use my direct support. And it just contributed to the failure of that. And there was really no resurrection of that group. There are ways to correct it, but those first 30, 60, 90 days are critical to the success of the restructuring, no matter what model you're going into.
Okay, I'm going to start throwing some, we're going to start addressing some of these questions, because your answer there leads directly into the question that we got throughout. If I'm not getting attorney engagement, okay, and the reason being is that, hey, I had some stumbles. So you don't have the luxury of making a mistake. You know, it's I know it's a people-based business, and mistakes are going to happen, but really that initial period, you got to be on your toes, you got to hit the ground running, which leads to a question that we got a number of times is, hey, what's the best way to roll this out? Phases, or rip the Band-Aid off and just make that change?
So yeah, I think we've seen firms do it both ways, and we've seen both be successful. I think the most failures we've seen have been in the ripping the Band-Aid off method, because it forces that new model to be successful from day one without any tweaks. And the moment a high-level partner has a bad experience, then that's their impression of that group. So in the phased approach, that's what Mattern likes to recommend. Do it by office, do it by practice group, any way that the firm can roll it out in phases, so that you roll it out to one group, here's some feedback that we've gotten, make some tweaks, roll it out to the next group, continue to make tweaks, and then by the end of the rollout, you have it as perfect as it can be. I think one example from my past experience that demonstrates that is one of the service providers that I previously worked for. We had a client who they decided to outsource their administrative operation, and they wanted to rip the Band-Aid off. They wanted to do it quickly. They didn't keep in-house personnel. They went fully outsourced, and it failed. Attorneys were complaining about work product, turnaround time, professionalism of the staff, and it was just a terrible mistake for that firm to have done that. And they came to the company I was working for at the time and asked, what can we do to save this? And so we proposed the phased approach. We took their most problematic office at the time, started providing services for them, worked on training, developing that reputation, built up that skill set, rolled it out to other offices, and eventually we had taken over all of those services in that phased manner. And it was a complete sea change for that firm. I think that is the best way to, if you're not 100% sure of this is a slam dunk, to make sure that it is a slam dunk by the end.
Okay, so they switched providers who went with the phasing approach versus the original method of just rolling it out and ripping the Band-Aid off. It wasn't ready. Okay. Let's say, okay, in an outsourced situation, I'm having performance issues. Okay, what's the quickest way to right that ship? Get it back on track if it's outsourced.
So if it's outsourced, ideally in your current contract, you will have a scorecard with penalties for failing to meet certain expectations. And those monetary penalties will incentivize them to make improvements, because that's cutting into their bottom line. That generally does improve performance, but in the event that you're getting penalties for 3 or 4 months in a row, then at that point, then maybe that's not the right solution. So you need to then take a more substantial action, putting together a corrective action plan and making sure that corrective action plan has time-based goals. So that if 60, 90 days in, they're still having the same issues, then it's not a one-off problem. It's not that they hired one bad employee that is making errors that they just need to replace. It is a systemic issue that their training is inadequate, or their recruiting is inadequate, or some combination of that. So having those time-based goals allows you to give them time to rectify it, test it against whatever benchmark was put in place. And if they succeed, then that's fantastic. Then it worked. If they don't succeed, then you need to either put together a backup plan for transition, either to another outsourcing provider or taking it back in-house, putting their feet to the fire that way. But before you even get to that point, you need to make sure that reporting is in place and someone at the firm is monitoring that reporting, because generally those issues don't come to that level until they've been existing for quite some time. So if you see volumes trending down, raise the flag then. Let them correct it before everyone at the firm is screaming about the issues. And as well as training, make sure that's included in the reporting and that they are fulfilling that commitment of providing ongoing training to their staff.
Or certification in Microsoft or whatever. Yeah, training should definitely be part of the performance standards in a contract. Who's getting trained, how often, and so on like that. Let's say it's an in-house operation and it's not working. Okay. Dollar penalties are kind of tough on an in-house situation. So that's off the table. And before you answer that question, is when you're outsourced and you have dollar penalties built for non-performance into your contract, it is always surprising to Mattern how many firms don't collect them. We'll tell them, hey, listen, you're eligible to assess X number of dollars, which would be a credit on the next monthly invoice. But a lot of firms say, well, I feel bad doing that, or, I'll let it go this month, and, that this month turns into next month, this quarter, and 6 months. And then meanwhile, they're getting reports that things are not working the way they should. I'm telling you, the dollar performance penalties of any type of outsourcing contract, not just administrative services, is a great way to manage the service provider. Otherwise, your only recourse is cancellation. It's kind of like the nuclear option. Okay. And bringing a service back in-house is, I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's difficult. Again, that's why you don't want non-solicitation, all this other kind of stuff in your contracts. But okay, if it's in-house, okay, it's not working the way it should. How do I correct it?
So the first thing I would recommend would be to conduct focus groups with attorneys. If there are specific attorneys that have complaints, if there's a specific practice group that they're always having issues, if your transactional group is completely satisfied, but your litigation department is always having issues, then meet with them, discuss with them what issues are you having. That way you have at least narrowed down what the problem is, that it's work specific to litigation. And then you can go to those departments if you've centralized those department heads. If it's a pooled model, go to those pools that are having issues and address training, address work product, address workflow processes. It could be that their litigation department's not using them because the turnaround time's too long and they have tight deadlines to meet, whereas the transactional department has a little bit more leeway in that. So getting that attorney feedback is critical in that moment in time, not only to resolve the issue, but also to let those attorneys know that you are working to resolve the issue, want to understand the issue, and keep them from tapping out of that system. Not thinking that this new restructure is not working for me.
Okay.
So those are the critical pieces.
Okay. And you mentioned when we were talking about a certain situation that almost like an internal salesperson who's going out there and beating the drum, or even, upper management, again, going out there and saying, rousing the troops to, hey, we want to hear what you need. We're going to supply that. It's going to be excellent quality and done in a timely fashion. But having that internal cheerleader, salesperson, how critical is that?
Yeah, I think that is very important, not only early on when you're switching to a new model, explaining the new model, how it's going to work, who they can reach out to, the structure of the team. That is incredibly important for the rollout, but also throughout the entire life of that department. They need to consistently get out there, because it could be that you've created 3 sub departments and a first year associate doesn't have any need for that department. But once they get to a 4th or 5th year associate level, then they do, but they don't remember hearing about it as a first year associate. So constantly selling that, marketing it, informing the attorney population about these resources that they have available is critical.
Okay. Anything else on correcting issues, either in-house or outsourced, that you want to just throw out there?
I don't think so.
Okay. Again, we want to try to set the system so we're not getting those issues, but if we do, tell you again, performance standards for both entities, but with the outsourcing, make sure there's dollar penalties, and then that internal cheerleader. And everyone thinks, hey, if I outsource, I don't have to manage this function. You do have to manage it. It's just a different type of management going forward. Okay, let's bounce over to what drastic steps have firms done to modernize support structure?
I think probably the most drastic step would be to outsource from an in-house operation. And it seems like a very scary proposition to take internal employees and then place them in a remote location where the firm doesn't have an office. But also just switching models is could be viewed as drastic. If you go from a direct support model to a centralized model or a pooled model, even if it's still in-house and maybe those same employees are still fulfilling that function, it could be a drastic shift from the view of the attorney. So I think really any shift from the attorney viewpoint could be viewed as drastic. But also if it could make it more drastic if you do take those and you put a new company in charge of that. If you switch overnight from a direct support model to a pooled support model, or it could even be considered drastic if you take your outsourced model and then bring it back in-house. So I think there are a number of things that firms have done, not necessarily negatively, but definitely big measures that they've taken to modernize their support structure.
Okay, you mentioned about moving employees to a remote location. Typically, it's not a remote location. It's another firm. You're centralized that function in one of the firm's offices that are less expensive. Or if they are going the outsourcing route, yeah, they are in some these outsourcing providers have some remote, Fargo, North Dakota, and Wheeling, West Virginia. And I know you're from Wheeling, Cory, so I'm not gonna. I want to be careful how I say that, but a lot of times firms don't move employees there. They keep them where they're currently at until there's attrition, and then they move that position to the remote location with sometimes significant savings, or
Right.
most of the time.
And kind of harking back to the phased approach. That's one of the benefits of that phased approach is you keep support employees that attorneys are familiar with in place, and then as they retire, as they leave to pursue a different career path, to move to another firm or whatever the case is, when they leave, then you're moving that position. So it's not as seen as a drastic change. It's a gradual change over time. And they're not saying, why did you take Steve from the desk outside of my office? They understand that he retired, so they're then moved to another location as part of this long-term plan. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well.
Okay. Is there a target ratio for administrative support to attorneys in this new world?
I think that's in the new world, that's a little bit of an outdated way of thinking about support. With the new models in place, the ones that we typically recommend in administrative projects. And just for full disclosure, when we do administrative projects, we're not typically recommending you go to a centralized model, an outsourced model, or a pooled model. It's typically a combination of those based on that feedback that we get from attorneys, based on the data provided of what works best for the firm. And it's usually that combination. So I think that ratio model assumes that you have one partner, 5 associates assigned to one legal administrative assistant. And in a pooled model or a centralized model, that's not really applicable, because that utilization is spread out over a number of employees. So you may have 30 secretaries today that are supporting 100 attorneys. But in a centralized model, you may have 15 support employees in this department that are supporting 500 attorneys, and they're keeping up with the work because the work is equally distributed. So I think the ratio model is a little irrelevant to some of the newer law firm support models.
Okay. Okay. While we may appreciate that attorneys are often self-sufficient, how do we make sure they are not spending their time doing work that could be done more efficiently by their assistant or another member of the support team? Great question.
That is a great question. And I think the answer to that is to implement that workflow tracking tool. So it's important to measure those tasks that are being completed. What's being completed by attorneys, not just billable work, but non-billable work. What is being completed by the support departments? Are they fully utilized? Are they underutilized? And looking at that to make sure that attorneys are utilizing those support departments, and if they're not, then conducting those surveys, conducting focus groups, and find out why. And again, that's something that if you don't have a workflow tool in place, we can look at with Revelation Legal and determine how much administrative burden is on those attorneys.
Yeah, it's sometimes it's shocking the amount of time that attorneys are still spending, even though they're self-sufficient, and especially younger generations. But it is shocking how much time they do spend on administrative functions. Okay, let's switch over to retaining and recruiting talent. Okay, one person submitted, okay, retaining and recruiting talent are occasionally problematic. Okay, and my first response was, well, if only occasionally, you're doing pretty well. Okay, that's really one of the biggest issues happening in the well, in-house and outsourced marketplace. It's, where do you find the people? So let's talk about that. How do we do it?
So I think in-house specifically, one of the things you can do to retain talent is to create a career path. So that's probably more easily done in a centralized or a pooled model rather than the direct support model, where you are creating subgroups that maybe one group handles basic administrative tasks that doesn't require a lot of legal knowledge, doesn't require a lot of law firm experience to handle. You just need some basic training on how the software works. Here are some guidelines, and you put those through. And then over time, those employees, even though they're doing those basic administrative functions, just in dealing with the law firm, being exposed to the law firm, are going to learn the ways and policies of the law firm and be able to then move forward into progressive administrative departments and develop that way. And I mean, there's not a whole lot of 25-year-olds that have graduated college recently that are looking to become a legal administrative assistant for the next 30 or 40 years. They are looking for development, learning new skills, facing new challenges. So I think setting them up to do that within the law firm is very important. For outsourcing, retaining talent, that's just, in all honesty, it's not the firm's problem. If the outsourcer is not retaining talent, that is their issue. But there are a few reasons that outsourcer would be facing attrition. Based on the latest data we have, outsourcing retention rates are at about 70%, so they're losing about 30% of their staff each year. And not all of that should be viewed as negatively. I mean, some of it is they're being paid lower wages, their benefits may not be as good as a law firm, and they've learned these skills that are applicable to law firms. So it would make sense that they would look for a position in-house at a law firm. So they're moving on, or they're moving up within that organization. So if an outsourcer has a manager position open, then it makes sense that someone who's doing well on your team would then move up to a promotional position.
Okay, but some of the things that we talk about that what in-house firms can do is, create the flexible work environment. They could work from home or in the office. Financial incentives, okay. Allow remote positions, okay. It would just expand your target market for hiring people. So there's things that you can do in-house. Again, that's where kind of outsourcing has a nice play, that they do offer that career path in a lot of situations. So, okay, aging practice assistant population. This firm has a great team, but in the next 5 years, many will be retiring. What do I do?
I think that presents the best position to restructure your current administrative team. I think 5 years is enough to put teams in place to either old model, a centralized model, start working on developing those departments and replacing those positions as they retire. So that way you can maintain that phased approach. You're not doing it all at once. Attorneys aren't gonna see a sudden change and start screaming. You're gonna be able to gradually install those departments for success.
Okay, so you have a nice ramp, 5 years. Okay, we got about 2 minutes left here. I just want to work in one more question. I got a couple questions from the audience, and one here that, how do you evaluate whether your model is working?
So there are a few ways. The most obvious, I think, is reporting. So if you have that workflow tool in place, if you have an outsourcer in place, looking at the reporting, making sure that volumes aren't consistently declining, making sure that year over year, quarter over quarter, that they are going up. But sheer volume isn't the only thing. You want to look at utilization by attorneys, practice groups. So if one practice group is declining in usage or not using at all, and the others are high, then you want to explore why that is. And we would also recommend periodic surveys, focus groups to follow up with those attorneys and find out what's working, what's not working, and that continually monitoring and maintaining those groups is important.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? If not, I got a few submitted here. I'm gonna throw out there. Okay. What about security of my documents?
So I think that mostly applies to outsourcing, and generally in every outsourcing engagement that Mattern has been involved in, either the outsourcing provider is going into the firm's network through VPN or through Citrix or through VMware or some other remote networking feature where the firm still has full control over all of that data that those firm employees are seeing. We've seen some firms restrict printing, but the firm still has full control over what that outsourced staff is doing, whether they're in Wheeling, West Virginia, or Fargo, North Dakota. So I think the firm should rest assured that they're still in control of their data.
Okay, so it shouldn't be a concern, but you got to flush that out and make sure. Okay, we are at 12:46. I want to be respectful of your time. There's a couple other questions that we'll follow up on afterwards. And Cory, I just want to thank you for doing a terrific job. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think you left any stone unturned, which is great. But I want to thank everyone for participating. Again, a shout out to our clients. We'll let you know who won the Dunkin' Donuts. And if anyone's interested in further in this discussion, please reach out. I'm more than happy to set up a time. We get Cory involved to address anything that we didn't cover or any of your concerns that you didn't want to voice publicly or whatever. So Thank you very much. Have a great day. And we'll see you at the next coffee break in October. I'm sorry, October. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.